Now, this was back a couple years ago. I don't actually remember very much, but this actually happened to a friend of mine who went to a really big swamp. Now, I won't name the location of the swamp for obvious reasons, but my friend at the time would call him Doug, as he really loved going on adventures and hikes. However, one of these times he had to go through a swamp, which was something he really did not want to do. The swamp had been on for miles, so he was pretty much walking through the swamp and he was looking around, seeing if he could find any gators or something. Now, as he was in the swamp area, he heard what seemed to be a howling noise coming from the distance. He obviously wasn't so sure of what it was, so he looked up and looked around, thinking that there could have been someone or something there, but there was no sign of them. It was getting really weird. He ends up calling out if somebody was there, but there was no reply. It happened to be going so fast that nothing really made sense. Doug had been hunting for years, and he never thought he'd be hunting in the swamp, but I guess he decided to try the swamp and see if he could get better game. He immediately looked to see that there was a deer who happened to be taking a drink by some water there in the swampy area. As the deer was taking a drink, that's when Doug started to get a little closer to the creature. As he was getting closer, the deer ended up looking up and then runs off. It obviously shocked Doug, as he didn't even know why this deer freaked out. He looked around thinking that there could have been something else nearby, but he really couldn't see. But he ended up looking over to see that there was actually a tent. It was in the far distance, so he was confused as to why the tent was there. He started walking towards the tent while calling out to someone if someone was there and that he wasn't here to hurt them, etc. As he was walking over and he was looking around, seeing if there was anyone nearby, he ended up looking inside the tent. There were belongings like clothes and some other stuff. Obviously, someone had been camping here, and he wasn't sure who would be camping in the swamp. He ended up looking up, and then he saw something. It obviously looked like what appeared to be tracks on the ground. They didn't look like anything, like any bear or anything. So he ended up deciding to investigate it a little better, and once he got a better look at it, he obviously was confused. They looked like boot footprints. Of course, it turns out that there were boots. So he basically had a feeling that whoever was here was definitely their campsite. He called out if someone was around, but there was nobody in sight. So as he continued, to look around and he continued to call out, he ended up looking to see that there was a man. Now this man looked to be about maybe 6 foot 4, and he was just staring at him. Now that was when Doug started to get a little bit suspicious, thinking, why was this guy still here, and was this his camp? It obviously didn't really make sense if it was his camp or not, but of course he can see that this man appeared to have an axe on him. The man with the axe approaches Doug, and of course that's when Doug ended up taking a shot at him with his gun, and as soon as he shot him, the man lets out a howling scream of pain as Doug ran back into the woods as fast as he could. He ran through the swamp and did not even stop until he got to his car. Once he got to his car, he jumped back in and he drove it out of sight. When he got back home, he obviously had no idea if this man was dangerous, but he seemed to be dangerous judging by the fact that he was carrying an axe. He reported to the police station when he got back into town, but the police hadn't updated him regarding him about the man he saw regardless. Whatever it was definitely really dangerous. And what was this man going to even do to him? That was the biggest question that he'd ever, never had thought of seeing. But, of course, was definitely one story that he gets really scared every time he thinks about it. Of course, he eventually brings it up to his girlfriend here and there, and his girlfriend was even horrified at the fact that this man was stalking Doug. Whoever was in that setup, that camp, could have fell victims to him, but of course that was another thing. He wasn't really too sure if it was actually the case or not. They didn't get any police reports regarding about who the guy was in the camp. They, of course, search and rescuers did search the camp, but they couldn't find any trace of that man or anything that could lead up to him. It still horrifies him to this day, knowing that this man may still be out there, or he could be arrested. They're not even sure which. Now, a couple of friends of mine who apparently went to high school, this happened to them sometime during their freshman year of college. They were pretty much on their spring break and they decided to go to a cabin that happened to be somewhere around New Jersey. Now, of course, my friend at the time of the story lived in the US after living in Canada with a contract for a few years. Her name was Millie, and she was with her boyfriend and two of her other friends, and they decided to take a trip to the cottage that happened to be in the swamp. Why was her cottage in the swamp was definitely a question a lot of people had asked her. She obviously didn't mind the swamp, aside from the bugs and maybe gators, but other than that, nothing scary or anything has happened to her. Until this night, however, it changed everything. Millie and her friends got there on the first day, and they unpacked and got everything ready and all set to go. They went inside their cabin, and they started having fun by playing some video games. But of course, them being on their phones, there wasn't really too much electricity around, so they had to make what's best of it. Now, at the time, Millie apparently really liked being in the swamp. Of course, most people really wouldn't like being in the swamp, but for some reason she really enjoyed being in the swamp. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was definitely something that really caught her attention. She had really liked going to swamps when she was a kid. Ever since she saw the movie Shrek, she really enjoyed the movie a whole lot, and always said she wanted to be an ogre for Halloween almost every year. While Millie and her friends were in the cabin just chilling and doing what normal people do, they of course continue on with more of what they were supposed to be doing. But of course, Millie's boyfriend ends up going outside to have a smoke. When he comes back in a few minutes later, he looked as pale as she saw a ghost, and that obviously really kind of freaked a lot of people out. They were confused, but of course he said that he saw something outside of the swamp cabin. They ended up looking around the area, but they couldn't find anybody, and they thought that maybe it might have been just a bear or some other creature roaming nearby. So they continued to do their own thing, and fast forward to around midnight was when Millie woke up to hearing what seemed to be like someone walking around the cabin. Obviously she heard it, so she ended up getting up to investigate. However, it was too dark outside, so she couldn't really hear or see very clearly, but she could hear walking. She ends up looking around, but she couldn't see anybody, and from the glow of the moon, she saw that there was a figure standing a couple feet away from the swamp. Obviously, she wasn't sure if it was a bear or any other creature, but It certainly didn't look like a bear. She closed the blinds and made sure the windows were locked in case if it was someone trying to get in. She stayed inside what appeared to be the cabin, and she stayed there for a while. She obviously didn't want to open up, thinking that whatever this thing was pretty much dangerous. She stayed in there for a while and was praying to God and hoped that whatever the creature was would just go away. She obviously had told her boyfriend there was something outside, and he said it was what he saw too. When they looked out the window, the creature was gone, and they weren't really too sure. They barely got enough sleep that night. The next morning they woke up to find some footprints in the mud. They saw a bunch of footprints walking around on the cabin, and it even showed that it didn't look like any bear or any creature known to man. They obviously weren't sure as to what kind of creature it was, but they obviously can assure that it was definitely some creature unknown. They weren't sure if it was a person or a creature, but they had a feeling it could have been some sort of creature that roamed the area. And they never went back to that cabin, as Millie's parents had sold it the next year, as Millie had been petrified to go there because of that one experience she had. It would always stay with her, but we also don't know what's the dangers and what else is going on in the world. Now, a friend of ours from school happened to be, his name was Don, and Don really liked going fishing in swamps. He really enjoyed fishing in swamps every now and then, but of course he really enjoyed camping in woods and stuff, but of course every once in a while he would fish in the swamp. It happened to be a few days before the end of summer, so Don and his buddy Rick decided to go fishing. They picked a really good swamp that was about maybe an hour or so away from where the town they used to live at. They went to this swamp, and of course they had a boat, so they ended up using the boat to go in the swamp, and they decided to go ahead and find a fishing spot. However, while looking for the fishing spot, they ended up seeing what appeared to be a gator nest nearby, so they ended up ignoring the gator and continuing on their way without disturbing it. Although they were still looking for a perfect fishing spot, they eventually found one and they started fishing. As they were fishing, they ended up looking over to see that there was something poking out from the water. Obviously, at first they thought that it could have been a gator, but it didn't look like an alligator at all. It definitely looked like something else, and it was just floating on top. They of course got a little closer, and once they did, they realized that it was a shirt. They pulled the shirt out, and they had no idea whose shirt it was, but it looked like it might have been some shirt from somebody. They end up looking around thinking that there could be other clues that would lead to something like this being the case. But of course, they didn't see anything. They ended up deciding to go to the park ranger anyone who knew the swamp. And when they got to the authorities, they ended up giving the authorities the swamp stuff. What they found in the swamp was a t-shirt, but they also found a bag and some other stuff. Search and rescue teams went to the scene, and they started trying to look to see if there was someone really lost in there, but they unfortunately never got an update on that. Don still to this day wonders if somebody could have died there, which was probably the case. Whoever the person was, and however they met their fate, was definitely something Don nor Rick know, but they always wondered what could have happened to this person who unfortunately lost their life in the swamp.